Look who's here, the dragonfly. It flies so fast, like tiny magic. Say hello to the wiggly worm. It's soft and loves to wiggle around. Let's meet the tiny mosquito. It's so tiny, but it loves to buzz. Say hi to the shiny beetle. It's tiny, but it shines like a toy. Look at my wiggly friend, the caterpillar. It wiggles so cute. Munch, munch, munch. Here comes the busy bee. It loves flowers just like me. Look, it's the jumping grasshopper. It jumps so high, like a tiny rocket. Here comes the tiny fire ant. It's fast and super busy all day. Here comes the long centipede. So many legs, it's like a tiny train. Look, here comes the little spider. It spins a web like magic strings. Here comes the sneaky cockroach. It's fast and it loves to hide. Say hello to the little ant. It's tiny but so strong. Tonight we meet the firefly. It shines like a tiny little star. Look, it's the rainbow scarab beetle. It shines so bright, like a tiny rainbow treasure bug. Look, it's the puss caterpillar. It's so fluffy, like a tiny moving pillow. Look, it's the jewel wasp. It shines so bright, like a tiny flying jewel. Look, it's the blue feather-legged fly. Its legs are so fluffy, like tiny blue feathers. Look, it's the peacock spider. It dances so cute, like a tiny rainbow dancer. Look, it's the lantern bug. Its nose is so funny, like a tiny lantern toy. Look, it's the flower mantis nymph. It looks like a flower, but it's a bug. Look, it's the pink plant hopper nymph. It's so pink, like a tiny jumping cotton candy. Look, it's the water strider nymph. It walks on water, even when it's little. Look, it's the lace bug nymph. Its back looks like tiny lace art. Look, it's the water measurer. It walks on water, like a tiny dancer bug. Look, it's the water scorpion. It looks so cool, like a tiny pond ninja. Look, it's the velvet ant. It's so fluffy, like a tiny walking teddy bug. Look, it's the minute pirate bug. It's so tiny, like a mini pirate explorer. Look, it's the stone centipede. It has so many legs, like a tiny walking train. Look, it's the leaf beetle. It's so shiny, like a tiny rainbow bug. Look, it's the green stink bug nymph. It looks so round, like a tiny green button bug. Look, it's the fire brat. It runs so fast, like a tiny spark bug. Look, it's the snow flea. It jumps on snow like a tiny winter popcorn. Look, it's the silverfish. It runs so fast, like a tiny shiny racer. Look, it's the bristletail. It jumps so high, like a tiny spring bug. Look, it's the web spinner. It spins silky tunnels, like a tiny builder bug. Look, it's the web spinner. It spins silky tunnels, like a tiny builder bug. Look, it's the caddisfly adult. It's so fluffy, like a tiny feather bug. Look, it's the glowworm larva. It lights up the dark like a tiny lantern bug. Look! It's the Dobson fly larva! It looks so cool, like a tiny water dragon. Look! It's the stonefly nymph. It walks underwater like a tiny diver bug. Look! It's the root aphid. It loves the roots, like a tiny gardener bug. Look! It's the shore bug. It runs so fast by the water. Look! It's the thrips. It's so tiny, but moves so quick. Look! It's the thrips. It's so tiny, but moves so quick. Look! It's the fungus gnat. It's so tiny, like a flying dust puff. Look! It's the fungus gnat. It's so tiny, like a flying dust puff. Look! It's the tiger beetle. It runs so fast, like a tiny racer bug. Look! It's the soldier termite. It's so brave, the protector bug. Look, it's the emerald wasp. It shines so bright, like a tiny green gemstone bug. Look! It's the blue dasher. It's so fast, like a tiny blue rocket bug. Look! It's the mealybug. It's so fluffy, like a tiny cotton bug. Look! It's the bark beetle. It makes tiny tunnels, like a mini builder bug. Look! It's the book louse. It loves books, just like me. Look! It's the antlion larva. It digs sand like a tiny bulldozer bug. Look! It's the red velvet mite. It's so soft, like a walking little pillow. Look! It's the green lace bug. Its wings look like tiny fairy lace. Look! It's the springtail. It jumps so fast, like a tiny popcorn bug. Look! It's the plant bug. It's so tiny and loves yummy leaves. Look! It's the water boat man. It rows like a tiny boat driver. Look! The whirligig beetle. It spins so fast, like a water spinner. Look! It's the back swimmer. It swims upside down, like a silly swimmer. Look! It's the earwig nymph. It's so tiny and wiggles everywhere. Look! It's the click beetle. It jumps with a click, so funny. Look! It's the jewel beetle. It shines so bright, like a tiny rainbow bug. Look! It's the hoverfly. It flies like a tiny helicopter bug. Look! It's the leafcutter ant. It carries leaves bigger than itself. Wow! Look! It's the tiger moth. It's so colorful, like a tiny flying tiger. Look! It's the sawfly larva. It wiggles so funny, like a tiny noodle bug. Look! It's the leafhopper. It hops so high, like a tiny jumper bug. Wow! It's the fire ant queen. She's big, she's strong, she's the boss ant. Look! It's the water strider. It walks on water, like magic feet. Look! It's the clever caddisfly. It builds a house with tiny rocks. Wow! Look! It's the tiny aphid. It's so small and loves yummy leaves. Look! It's the little woodlouse. It rolls up so cute, like a tiny ball. Look! It's the pretty lacewing. Its wings look like tiny lace. It's the tiny mayfly. It flies so gentle, like a little fairy bug. Look! It's the shine silverfish. It moves so fast, like a tiny swimmer. Look! It's the speedy firebrat. It runs so quick, like a tiny rocket bug. Look! It's the little weevil. Its nose is so long, like a tiny banana. Look! The glowing firefly. It shines so bright, like a tiny star. Look! It's the stick insect. It looks like a stick, but it's alive. Wow! Look! It's the dung beetle. It rolls things everywhere, like a tiny worker. Wow! It's the praying mantis. It looks so cool, like a tiny ninja. Listen, here comes the cicada. It sings so loud, like a tiny drummer. Look, here's the earwig. It's tiny, with funny little pinchers. Look, it's the leaf insect. It looks like a leaf, but it's a bug. Wow! Look, it's the funny stink bug. It's friendly, but smells so silly. Buzz Bush, here's the housefly. It flies so fast, like a tiny racer. Here comes the shiny dragonfly. It flies so fast, like tiny magic. Here comes the bouncy flea. It's so small, but it jumps so high. Let's meet the tiny termite. It's small, but it works so hard. Look, the gentle moth is here. It loves the light, just like magic. Look at the tiny ladybug. It's so tiny and so pretty. Wow, here's the butterfly. It's colorful and it dances in the air. Today we meet the grasshopper. Listen, it goes chirp, chirp, and it can jump so high. Look, it's the leaf insect. It looks like a tiny walking leaf. Look, it's the silverfish. It's so shiny, like a tiny silver rocket bug. Look, it's the star-eyed rove beetle. Its eyes look like tiny shining stars. Look, it's the violet carpenter bee. It's so purple, like a tiny glowing teddy bee. Look, it's the emerald cockroach wasp. It's so shiny, like a tiny emerald fairy bug. It's the pink katydid. It's so pink, like a tiny cotton candy bug. Look, it's the lunar hornet moth. It looks like a tiny moon fairy bug. Look, it's the antlion larva. It makes doodles in the sand, like a tiny artist bug. Look, it's the silky lacewing larva. It's so silky, like a tiny soft fairy worm. Look, it's the blue mud dauber wasp. It's so shiny, like a tiny blue metal bug. Look, it's the pumpkin spider. It looks like a tiny pumpkin walking. Look, it's the golden tortoise beetle. It looks like a tiny gold coin bug. Look, it's the humpbacked fly. It walks so funny, like a tiny wobbly bug. Look, it's the glasswing butterfly. Its wings are see-through, like tiny magic glass. Look, it's the plume moth. Its wings look like tiny feathers, so pretty. Look, it's the saddleback caterpillar. It's so funny, like a tiny saddle toy bug. Look, it's the blue dasher damselfly. It's so shiny, like a tiny water fairy bug. Look, it's the bark louse. It's so tiny, like a little tree fairy bug. Look, it's the twig wilter bug. It looks just like a tiny walking stick. Look, it's the whirling beetle. It spins so fast, like a tiny water spinner bug. Look, it's the leaf cutter ant. It's so strong, like a tiny leaf superhero bug. Look, it's the frog hopper. It jumps so high, like a tiny frog bug. Look, it's the fairy fly. It looks like a tiny flying fairy bug. Look, it's the candy stripe leaf hopper. It looks like candy, a tiny jumping candy bug.